Welcome back. You are tuned into Salah Media. This is the special focus. My name is Deedat, and we are together till 9 p.m. this evening. Of course, discussing the State of the Nation address in pre-SONA analysis as we get closer to the day. Tomorrow will be the State of the Nation address. The president will address the nation and deliver that address, but it will be quite different compared to previous years. It's been a tough year for the world as we battle the coronavirus pandemic, and about a year ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa delivered his State of the Nation address in Parliament as usual. Back then, coronavirus was hardly thought of amongst the general population as it spread through China. However, the havoc it caused since landing on our shores has no doubt been extremely significant. The disaster that has occurred as a result has gotten us looking into the government, towards the government rather, for policies to help us navigate through the crisis. And there's no doubt that the nation will be all ears as President Ramaphosa delivers State of the Nation Address 2021. What are the people expecting? Well, that's what we're going to find out this evening, and we'd like to hear from you as well. We have our guest lined up, Hameda Deedat, an activist and researcher. She joins us now to speak about the expectations ahead of the speech, but we'd also like to hear from you. So let us know what's on your mind and what are your expectations. The WhatsApp number to do so is 061 766 0355. Alternatively, you can tweet and tag at Salam Media, and you can leave a comment below our YouTube and Facebook live broadcast. Please don't forget to use the hashtag the special focus when doing so. So let's get right into it. Assalamu alaikum, Hamida, and welcome to the show.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and shukran again for having me.
So we have less than 24 hours until SONA 2021. Lots of anticipation ahead of SONA.
Sorry, just say that again. What's to be expected?
Okay, so what I'm saying is there's 24 hours, less than 24 hours, in fact, until SONA 2021, and lots of anticipation, lots of expectation from the president. Of course, he's had quite a significant challenge on him and his leadership, navigating through the coronavirus crisis. That's been the dominant challenge, but there are many various other challenges that have faced the country over the last year. So in terms of economic policies announced in SONA 2021, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the implementation of the policies that were announced in SONA 2020?
Thanks so much, I must say, when I was busy preparing for this, and one of the questions that you raised was in relation to what was asked, did we actually achieve what happened in 2020 or what we aspired to do, or the president as the government. I actually had to sit back and think quite extensively, exactly what was there. 2020 seems so far away, and I think your opening remarks in relation to COVID is on point. It's precisely because COVID hit and the world as we knew it in February 2020, and it was just a couple of weeks before, or maybe almost a month before we then went into lockdown. So clearly, even the president at the time of presenting the SONA had absolutely no clue of what the challenges, and definitely challenges indeed, was what he was going to face the whole of 2020 coming into 2021. So just as a reminder, I think one of the key points that the president made was he spoke about social compact. And he was saying that, in order for the country to move forward, you'd need all the different stakeholders to come together. There was a deep recognition and an honest reflection that unemployment and poverty was quite severe in the country, and that if you look at the Gini coefficient, South Africa was still pegged as number one for being the highest, or the country with the highest level of inequality between the rich and the poor. In terms of job creation, again, in terms of our unemployment level, at that point, I think the stats as I was saying is was close to 27%, which was, some of us would have argued was not 100% accurate, but still 27% was seen as quite a scary number, and therefore there was a commitment made by government to put in money to be able to build or to create jobs and to address some of the key challenges. And in fact, at that point, he made reference to millions of people who are out of work, and that they would make a commitment through the job summits, through the engagement with labor, business, and government, and as well as communities, to actually address quite severely the job and unemployment shortage, and then to create jobs. I think there was also an acknowledgement that the high levels of youth unemployment was quite an issue, and that skills, infrastructure development, and addressing the key challenges facing the youth were definitely areas of priority. Another key one was the issue around ESCOM. I think we all knew and saw quite extensively the problems around ESCOM energy being quite insecure, with massive load shedding happening throughout the year. And there was a commitment by government to actually address some of these key challenges. I think one of the fundamental ones, I mean, because we had already been since 2018, 2019, experiencing a recession, the president's entire orientation, and I think something that was then reflected in Titimbaweni's budget speech thereafter, was that there was going to be a concerted effort to actually address some of the key challenges, particularly around identifying what our greatest potential for growth was, and then just to stimulate and stabilize our economy. So that was really, in terms of forward thinking, those were some of the key positive outlooks that the president had. And obviously, if we have to beg the question, was he able to achieve what he had set out to do? I think in most instances the answer is no. If you just look at the levels of unemployment between the period of March, I think it was March when the first lockdown hit, to June, I think we lost about almost 3 million jobs. So initially we had high levels of unemployment. We were wanting to create jobs, but in the interim, but as a result of COVID, what actually happened is we lost millions of jobs. We also saw, coupled with that, high levels of retrenchments, companies closing. Again, I didn't mention the issue of corruption. I know in the SONA there would have been mention of corruption, but because of so many challenges that government was faced with, and having to shift your resources or your priorities to different areas, even the issue of corruption unfortunately didn't get the attention that it was we were hoping to see. And in fact, what most disgracefully, I think, we saw people actually accentuating examples of corruption or behavior of corruption, where PPE and even food parcels that were dedicated towards either health workers, to schools, or even the poor, in terms of food parcels, were actually stolen. And we know that even, an absolute indictment is the issue around the TERS that has just been, that has just come to the light, where employers had actually applied for TERS, were successful in the application, received the money, and then failed to pay the money over to workers who were then suffering as a result of the hard economic crisis as a result of COVID-19. So I think definitely quite a challenge for the president, indeed.
Yes, indeed, it is. It has been quite a challenge, and this is something that the COVID crisis has been something that it's an unprecedented challenge and a crisis that nobody could really have planned for. Because if you asked one maybe a year ago, in January 2020, we would not really have thought of the coronavirus as being that serious all the way here in South Africa, when it was in fact spreading in China at the time. And the issues which you've highlighted, which were in fact mentioned in SONA 2020, for example, ESCOM having been in trouble for years, in fact, load shedding today, the latest announcement of stage 3 load shedding, promises of job creation. That's not an entirely new promise coming from the president, and that came last year, it came the year before that as well. But unfortunately, over the last year, not much has changed. We still, as I mentioned, ESCOM still having to implement load shedding on a regular basis, and not much has changed there. Unemployment has risen. Well, of course, we could say that the initial hard lockdown is to blame partly for the increase of unemployment that occurred last year. But do you think it's appropriate to blame the lack of improvement squarely on the COVID crisis?
Okay, so I think, thank you very much. That's an absolutely imperative question. As I mentioned in my introduction, the question of South Africa's economy being in a very poor state was exceptionally evident from 2017, and we saw 2018, 2019, we went into recession. 2020, not only did we see recession, but we actually saw a budget speech that started to drive us into austerity, where the cost of living for the poor, in particular, became exceptionally high. Taxes increased, and while the wealth continued to be appropriated by the rich, the poor, by and large, in the country started to suffer immensely, and still continue to suffer. So they were very bad choices, economic choices that were made by government prior to COVID. We saw, infrastructure collapsing. We saw our manufacturing sectors close down. Investment was happening in the country, but the nature of the investment was more with capital flight as opposed to actually, bringing returns on the investment or job creation. We saw many firms close down, and in fact, we were going through a process of deindustrialization rather than industrialization. I think when we talk about the high levels of unemployment was starting to rise quite significantly from 2015, 16, 17, and I think it just got worse over the last few years. And in the same way, in terms of the instability of our economy, if you just think of the threat of Moody and how many times he had threatened to downgrade us, and then how many times he actually downgraded us prior to COVID-19. In fact, I think we were downgraded before the COVID crisis hit. In fact, it was just in March, and then I think 2 weeks later, we had COVID. So I think we were already in a crisis. We had made really, really bad decisions. I mean, if you think of ESCOM, the mess that ESCOM was in has nothing to do with COVID. Government had made really bad choices in terms of funding a state utility without ensuring that the necessary mechanisms to avoid the money being stolen was put to an end. In the same way that the other state enterprises, whether we're talking about PRASA, Metro Rail, SAA, which was another debacle. I mean, all of these were riddled and continue to be riddled with corruption. And these were choices and things that had happened, and we found ourselves in a crisis prior to COVID-19. And for government or for anybody to want to pretend that everything was quite fine in our country and that we were economically stable and that we were actually prospering prior to COVID-19, and then obviously things dramatically changed because of COVID would be dishonest. I think what COVID actually did was actually expose the bad state that our economy was in, because had we been in a better state, it's not to say that we would not have had that COVID would not have had a negative impact. Of course, it would have had a negative impact, but the extent of the impact would definitely have been less if we were in a stronger position economically. And one has to just look at the countries internationally, the developed countries, who, as a result of their strong economies, not to say that they didn't suffer or that they didn't have workers lose jobs, etc. Each country, in fact, every country in the world that had to deal with the COVID crisis had an economic crisis that was accompanied. But the extent to which the damage was caused was dependent on two things. And I think you also raised the other issue is how you respond to it and how strong your economy was. And then I think in both instances we were found wanting.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, would you say that the economic situation that we are in is the effect of incompetence and perhaps just exacerbated and accelerated by COVID?
Yeah, look, I think I wouldn't call Tito Mboweni incompetent. I think or even the ministers who provide, or the economists who provide Tito Mboweni with advice. I don't like what they do. I don't share the economic, the kind of neoliberal orientation and trajectory that the country is going on. I don't support it all. I don't believe that you should be on an economic growth path where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I don't believe that you need to implement austerity and actually shrink the possibility for ordinary South Africans to be able to participate in the market. And through participating in the market, you can actually create an economy where people are actually able to buy, and through that process, you actually stimulate the economy. I think the kinds of decisions that are being made are neoliberal in its orientation, and they serve a particular class interest. So they serve capital. The aim and objective is to maximize profits and to serve the interest of, many people make reference to the fact that the ANC and our government is captured. So whoever the capturers are have a particular modus operandi, and I think the economists that are advising Tito are quite supportive of that particular trajectory, and they by no means stupid. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They just don't have a conscience in relation to, wealth at what cost? So they don't really care how many people suffer as a result of really bad choices, because the choices are not being made in the interest of all of the people in South Africa. And I'd like to go back to a point that the president had made in his 2020 SONA. He was saying that when we choose the particular path that we're going to embark on in 2020, it should stand. I'm paraphrasing. It should stand the test of time, and should stand. It should actually be evidence of us as South Africans coming together, working together through a social compact, forging a solution for us as a country. And I think having said that, and you look at the economic path, growth path that government has chosen, it's actually a direct contradiction, because it does not support working together. It does not support recognizing the rights and the needs of South Africans as enshrined by our constitution.
And I'd like to hear what the listeners have had to say regarding this and the various issues that the country has been facing over the last year, and what are your expectations ahead of the SONA 2021. And just looking at some of the comment coming in on Facebook here from Afsal Nur Mohammed, who says, defender of the corrupt ANC, he and his useless ANC have no clue on any socio-economic issue other than mismanagement, state capture and corruption. He and his rubbish party must be charged for treason against South Africa. Coming quite strong there, some of the listeners, when commenting on this very particular discussion. And I think it points to a sort of the mood of frustration that many have had in the country, with the various challenges that we've been facing. And then on Twitter as well, last year, I just want to pick up on one of the points mentioned, was that last year and the year before, in fact, I think even President Ramaphosa's first State of the Nation address way back in 2018, a lot was spoken about turning SOEs around and making them profitable, rebuilding these state-owned enterprises. And comments coming in here on Twitter from one of them from Kandanim CBS says, the appointment of Andre de Ruyter was a clear sign that Ramaphosa wants to collapse ESCOM, SAA, he collapsed literally. There's another comment here coming in from another Twitter user, Sito Tilisha, who says SABC is operating at a loss for the 2019-2020 financial year. The AD foresees a further degeneration of the situation at the SABC because of the failure of leadership to implement a turnaround plan. This is one of the policies which were spoken about quite a bit in the previous State of the Nation addresses. And as we've seen, not much has changed with regards to state-owned enterprises. Hameda?
Well, I think in actual fact, perhaps what needs to be stated quite categorically is that there is a insidious push towards privatization. And in some instances, and one can maybe call me cynical in this particular regard, but I actually believe that the collapsing of our state-owned enterprises is actually purposeful. ESCOM, for the majority of South Africans, if it is held within the public hands and remains a public good, would benefit, because usually when you have a public good, you deliver the service in the interest of the broader country and South Africans. If it's in the hands of the private sector, then privatization leads to profit making, and therefore the cost of electricity becomes higher. In the same way that you talk about transport, and you can make reference to each of the SOEs. So I think there's been a deliberate agenda to undermine our country, to ensure that whatever was a public good is actually eroded and becomes a private investment, rather than actually maintaining it as a public good.
And before we go on, I just want to pick up on this. So who do you think is driving what you call this deliberate attempt to collapse SOEs?
So just say the question again.
Well, I'd like to expand on one of the points you mentioned. When you said that there seems to be a deliberate attempt to collapse SOEs. So who would you say is driving this attempt, which you speak about?
Private investment. If you take SAA, in whose interest is it to actually ensure that SAA, as a public institution, despite the fact that it's managed on commercial lines, is collapsed? The private sector. If you look at ESCOM, they want to do unbundling of ESCOM. In fact, they talk about unbundling, but nobody actually teases out what are the actual critical challenges that one is facing within Eskom. And does unbundling as a solution actually address those issues? Unbundling is about taking, the three different forms, like distribution, um, sorry, I can't remember the three parts of Eskom, generation, and there's one more. So you're taking the three different parts of Eskom, breaking it into entities, creating boards, putting them into, making them operate as three economic entities, and then you expect that that's going to solve the crisis. But it wasn't. Eskom is currently run with three different entities, despite the fact that it's not technically unbundled in three different firms or with three different boards and three different directors. But that's not what caused Eskom to collapse. By and large, what caused Eskom to collapse is the fact that there was massive corruption, there was no operation and maintenance, the replenishment of skills. As the skills and the engineers were leaving Eskom, the people that there was no institutional memory left behind. There was no capacity being brought into Eskom, and as a result, we saw massive failure. So to talk about unbundling as a failure, and I'm sorry, I'm just using Eskom as a particular example because I'm very familiar with it. Doing unbundling doesn't solve any crisis in Eskom. It's just going to make electricity more expensive, and people who are going to sit in the three entities are going to make a hell of a lot of money. And the reality is we don't have an alternative energy supplier. We've got IPPs, but it's again done through a private form as opposed to a public form, and therefore they'll just go into competition. And despite the fact that IPPs, which are your independent power producers through renewable energy, if they have to compete with Eskom, they'll make their money not because renewable energy is cheaper, but because they'd be able to provide you with a sustainable electricity supply vis-a-vis Eskom that's in a disarray. So I think the point that we were talking about capture, I made reference to capturing. So there are certain interests that are being served in relation to the collapse. One is people are making a hell of a lot of money through corruption, and secondly, once it collapses, you've got people who would come in, they'd buy up the entity for next to nothing. They would be able to retain the assets, and at the end of the day, they will make hundreds of millions of rands on our expense, because all of that infrastructure was actually built by the South African state, whether it was the apartheid state or not. The point, it was South African taxpayers' money that actually built those entities.
Hameda, as much as I'm enjoying this discussion on state-owned enterprises and the collapse of state-owned enterprises, I think it's one of the topics to look into for later on. But we've got to stick to unfortunately, due to the time restrictions as well, we've got to stick to the topic of State of the Nation address. I'd love to dig deeper into this discussion around SOEs, but hopefully we can do that at another time. So just moving on with our discussion around the State of the Nation address, which is expected to be delivered tomorrow. What should we look out for in terms of economic policies? What are we expecting to hear from the president?
Well, you're going to hear more cuts, and more cuts. So the public sector is in massive trouble. We know that under when Tito Mboweni announced his budget speech, both in February as well as in October, he was quite clear that the public sector wage bill in his calculation is too high, and therefore we need to shed jobs in the public sector. And this is despite the fact that within the health sector alone, under COVID, it's demonstrated quite blatantly that in actual fact that the hospitals are understaffed and that we do not have the necessary capacity. 37,000 jobs in the health sector have not been replaced, are still vacant, and despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we're not seeing job creation. So we're going to see more talk of austerity. I think the president is going to, as a family, is going to, appeal to us as a family, as our fellow South Africans. We've gone through a very difficult time, but then he's also going to tell us in a very subtle way how it is that we're going to have to carry the cost of the vaccine, how it is that we're going to have to carry the cost that so many people had lost their jobs. And when you talk about Moody, that's currently threatening us to downgrade, you're talking about Eskom that's going down the tubes, that's still doing load shedding. You're talking about all the SOEs, including SABC, that's in a crisis. You're talking about high levels of unemployment and the fact that the government had to pay out TERS, UIF had to be spent. There's massive levels of corruption. They weren't able to actualize the infrastructure projects and job creation possibilities. So somebody's going to have to carry carry the weight. And I think as much as the president is going to coach it in very nice language and soften the blow, ultimately it's going to be austerities on the cards, and the people of South Africa are going to have to tighten their belts even further, and buckle up and expect food prices to go through the roof, wage increases to not happen, and we're going to see inflation go through the roof.
Indeed, it will be interesting to see what the president has to say tomorrow, and of course, the finance minister will also expand on some of the policies, the economic policies, which will be mentioned tomorrow night. But just to wrap up with one of the questions that I've asked listeners as well this evening, what would you like to hear from the president say in the State of the Nation address tomorrow night?
I think first and foremost, if the president can actually recognize that the macroeconomic policy chosen by the ANC to date is the wrong path, and that they will fundamentally have to review and actually meet with progressive economists to look at a social compact that speaks to addressing high levels of unemployment, but progressively, not through austerity. If he moves away from austerity budget and really recognizes how growth and development has to happen by developing a different form of an industrial strategy that talks about job creation, that talks about developing our manufacturing sector, that talks about developing local capabilities in order for us to be able to produce what we need. I think in the context of the COVID vaccine, if he has to say, well, what we've learned from this particular experience is that COVID-19 is here to stay, and it might take many different forms, and to constantly be in line or in a line where you're expecting the vaccine from the north, as opposed to developing your own capabilities to be able to develop it. South Africa has the capacity. We have the scientists as well as the labs, and why investment should be through a process of an external funder coming into the country, using our resources and our workers to be able to develop a vaccine and then export it, as opposed to saying, well, why don't you give us the capacity through TRIPS, which is the trade-related intellectual property rights, give us the right to be able to develop our own vaccine, so that we can actually, rather than buying it and making the people of South Africa pay for it, let's actually produce it here, provide it to the rest of Africa, but also develop the capacities and create jobs. I think in terms of the rollout, it would be really brilliant if the president can actually link the rollout of the vaccine to the issue of job creation, rather than talking about private sector investment. If we can actually see jobs being created, the demand for the youth to get involved in the rollout program, skills and training happening. And again, like I said, if we're talking about the vaccines, creating labs and institutions for us to be able to develop our local capacities along the value chain, I think those would be really, really fundamental. And I think more importantly in the public sector, particularly because the current onslaught against the public sector, which is our schools, our hospitals, our police, including our municipal services, if we can actually see a direct commitment from government actually acknowledging that them signing the IMF loan, stating that in actual fact they will cut the public sector wage bill, was actually a huge mistake, and that in actual fact they're going to make a serious commitment to facilitate and support the skills to come back into the sector and make a commitment to develop the public sector. That would be absolutely wonderful. And most importantly, if you can put in mechanisms to stop corruption and seriously address the crises that we're seeing within our SOEs, and make a serious commitment, not just rhetoric, but actually develop a plan to really bring about job creation and prosperity for all South Africans. But also, and I mean, I think in terms of CPI food inflation, if the president actually has to put a cap on how much staple food can be sold at, in the same way that he actually drops, in fact, gives like almost a tax concession that certain food products must be sold at a certain price, and that the CPI index, which is your inflation index for food, cannot go higher than a certain percentage. I think even if people are not able to receive money in order to be able to survive, if you drop the food prices, the little that people have would be able to go a much longer way. I think that would definitely show us serious commitment towards South Africans.
Mhm. And I think hearing about these policies, hearing the president say it is great because we hear this acknowledgement from leadership, and it's something we do want to hear. But of course, the important part is seeing the implementation of these policies and reaping the benefits of these policies for the broader public. That's what's the important part of this. But I think we're gonna have to see what the president has to say tomorrow. And just a comment here quickly coming in from a Facebook viewer. Afzal Mohammed also once again saying the only way to make SOEs profitable is to privatize or go the parastatal route. Telcom is a successful parastatal. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, and there's quite a bit to speak about. But we're going to have to leave it there for this evening. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Shukran for having me.
All right, that was Hameda Deedat, an activist and researcher, speaking to us about the anticipation and expectations ahead of SONA 2021. It's going to be interesting to see what the president has to say and how these policies will actually be implemented. And we were in this discussion. In fact, we were looking at some of the policies which were announced last year, and we were assessing and evaluating how far the country has come since then in terms of implementation, and unfortunately, not much has changed, and a lot has also been a lot of the crises that the country faces have been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the pandemic could not, be blamed entirely for the crises that the country faces. But that's where we're going to have to leave it this evening. And if you are tuning in from the Isipingo region in Durban, south of Durban, you'd really be looking forward to next week's show. We are hoping to get you a counselor on air as well. After one of the residents approached myself and speaking to us about the service delivery issues in the area. I've been hearing of a lack of service delivery in the area. And of course, we are going to try and look into that next week. We're going to try and get your counselor to get on air, and the community also as well. We encourage you to participate in the discussion. But that's coming up next week, Wednesday. We do hope that you look forward to that, and we do hope that you'll tune in to hear that discussion. That's where we're going to have to leave it this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in, although a few hiccups in the beginning, but we are grateful for a great show after 8:30. Nonetheless, it's been a great discussion speaking about expectations ahead of SONA 2021. From myself, Zahid Jadid, and the team, thank you so much for tuning in. We do hope that you enjoyed the show and you tune in once again next week. Please do stay tuned to Salam Media.